Okay, so it all starts with this. This snippet of code was leaked online in November. It was created by Dahua, a Chinese state-owned company, which is a central player in the vast apparatus of surveillance technologies deployed by the Chinese government. This piece of code, likely written by just a few developers and data scientists over the course of a few days, performs facial recognition and assigns each face a score corresponding to race. You can kind of see that here. In this case, the code really is designed to target Uyghurs, a Muslim minority group that has been subject to brutal ethnic targeting by the Chinese. And indeed, this particular set of characters, under 24 characters in total, is what allows the identification of Uyghurs at a scale and a scope that would have been previously unimaginable for any government really at any time in human history, capable of being deployed nearly uniformly and consistently across a country composed of nearly 1.5 billion people, all in under 24 characters total. I think it's 22 characters without any of the spaces. And so to be clear here, my point starting out is about much more than the Uyghurs, although I'd like to actually pause for a moment to note that their plight is, in my view, one of the greatest human rights catastrophes of the 21st century. There are an estimated 1 million people currently in concentration camps. The US government now describes what's happening there as a genocide. I think all of us have a responsibility to do what we can to stop it. Organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch have focused on the issue. There's an organization called the Uyghur Human Rights Project here in Washington, D.C. That is one other specific organization focused on these issues. But the reason why I am starting today's talk by talking about the plight of the Uyghurs is because I view this code as an illustration of really something much broader than the Uyghurs alone. I view it as a trend that illustrates or that directly impacts all of us as we embed digital technologies into nearly every facet of our lives. To me, this code, these 24 characters, signifies the power of digital technologies to shape and structure our society with ease and sometimes with linguistic elegance, and always, and I think always and surprisingly, with stunning efficiency. All of this in ways that are difficult, if not frankly impossible for citizens and consumers who are busy living our everyday normal lives to fully understand. It is small pieces of code just like this that form the backbone of entire systems. And these systems, public, private, both, very often unseen, shape many of our lives in ways that are both large and small. And that leads me to the agenda for today's talk. Namely, I want to talk about 3 specific trends related to the digitization of our everyday lives and to the broader and sometimes unseen impact of digital technologies on citizens and consumers around the world. Each trend has its own bullet on the slide, which I'll just read out loud here. Privacy is dead, so is trust, and you're not who you think you are. So what do I mean by digital? Anything that can be digitized. What do I mean by digitized? Really, anything that's represented as code. And so when I talk about the digital transformation of our everyday lives, I'm talking about how images are captured in the course of our daily lives by increasingly ubiquitous surveillance cameras that, as of 10 years ago, were capturing 4 billion hours of footage a week in just the US alone. I'm talking about how almost all of our methods of communication, from emails to text to social media and word processing, now involve at minimum the use of computers and at maximum the use of the protocols the internet is based upon. And I'm talking about the so-called Internet of Things, which seeks to turn everyday objects into connected devices and digitize their functions. Examples of the ever-expanding Internet of Things range from, frankly, the practical to the ludicrous. There are, for example, pacemakers that control when patients' hearts beat. By one account, every new such device implanted in the US is now connected to the internet. There are internet-connected cars, an estimated 64 million of them on the roads last year. And there are doorknobs and toilets and light bulbs and practically anything you can imagine. And in fact, here's a challenge for everyone dialing in. Pick a noun, it can be any noun, and conduct an online search with that noun plus the phrase smart device. If my experience is any guide, you're going to find someone somewhere selling a variant of it. I've tested this. I've yet to find a noun that I can't, that no one is selling a smart device for, including smart trees, which was one I actually thought I might be stumped. And these trends are only growing. Estimates place the number of connected devices at over 75 billion by 2025 in just 4 years. And so we live in a world that's increasingly digital, where the line between digital and physical is becoming blurred, if not totally meaningless. And this is having deep and profound impacts on our daily lives. And so to start with is the impact we can feel. The world is becoming more convenient for us. In this sense, I think this trend, this digitization, is quite positive, especially when living through something like a global pandemic. Without the digital world, we would not be here today. I would not be here speaking to you, whatever it is that we mean by here. But then there are the obvious downsides of these trends. The collective state of our privacy and our security is a vexing, thorny issue, as we see with every data breach that's dominated the headlines over the last few years, months, weeks. And so again, let me repeat what I have here on the slide. Privacy is dead, so is trust, and you're not who you think you are. After I'm going to end this talk, or hope to end this talk, with some concrete suggestions about what we can and should do to address each development that I outline as lawyers, as policymakers, and as citizens from around the world. So let's start with the end of privacy. I authored an op-ed for the New York Times with Dan Geer. For folks who are, I highly encourage you to read many of his writings. We authored this a few years ago. It was entitled "The End of Privacy," depicted here. And we talked about the growing trend of data breaches and the resulting deterioration of our privacy. I'd also note that was before we knew about Cambridge Analytica or Facebook's other 20+ privacy scandals from 2018 alone, before we learned about their $500 million personal records breach just in the last few weeks. This was before SolarWinds. It was before any of the number of major hacks that have occurred since then. And the essence of our argument was that privacy, dating back to the 1890 seminal law review article by future Supreme Court Justice in the US, Louis Brandeis, and attorney Samuel Warren, privacy has really been defined as the right to be let alone. Now, the right to privacy actually has a much longer history. For folks on this call, I would actually very much recommend the paper by James Whitman, a professor at Yale Law, called "The Two Western Cultures of Privacy, Dignity versus Liberty." He really, I think, brilliantly chronicles the history of privacy, particularly as it relates to tensions between continental conceptions of privacy in the EU and kind of Anglo-American conceptions of privacy, which I think actually helps to highlight why many of us, when we say privacy, we mean different things. But for the purposes of this talk, Brandeis and Warren's notion will do for us for now, again, the right to be let alone, because I think it captures a fundamental assumption really underlying all notions of privacy up until today. And that assumption is that there is a quantifiable difference between being observed and being identified. That is, in the public world of observation, observation is not something we can remove ourselves from. Individuals must, in the course of our everyday interactions, venture out into public, where strangers might observe how we look, who we're with, what we're wearing, etc. Being identified, on the other hand, is an altogether different type of activity. Identification pierces the veil, so to speak, of our anonymity. It prevents us from being left alone, and it potentially intrudes upon our sense of dignity. And dignity, I think, is a particularly core component for European conceptions of privacy. But this is the essence of our argument, and I would venture, I think this is the essence of the modern day. This distinction is no longer. To put it as simply as possible, if you can be observed, you can be identified. And this is thanks to a confluence of factors, an abundance of data. In a digitized world, everything we do generates data, cheaper and faster compute power and storage, also called the cloud, and new techniques for identification brought about by machine learning, commonly referred to as AI. And so taken together, more data, cheaper compute power, AI, means that almost any, the methods for taking almost any data and rendering that data identifiable keep growing. A few of my favorite examples of activities that are no longer private are the act of walking, the act of writing, and the act of keeping your cell phone turned on. And I'm going to walk through each of those. Okay, so let's start through walking. In 2018, the Associated Press published this report on China's effective use of gait analysis to identify individuals based on the way their bodies move when they walk, otherwise known as their gait. According to the report, the techniques in use can identify people from up to 50 meters or 165 feet away, even with their back turned or face covered. And this can fill a gap in facial recognition, which needs close-up, high-resolution images of a person's face to work. So in certain places, certain parts of China, elsewhere, the very act of walking in public is no longer a private one. Okay, on to writing. Machine learning researchers have demonstrated that given a baseload of enough writing samples, the authorship of new text can be identified with frightening accuracy. Here's how one group of researchers stated the problem in this paper, the headline of which is on the slide. They write, given the increasing availability of writing samples online, our result has serious implications for anonymity and free speech. An anonymous blogger or whistleblower may be unmasked unless they take steps to obfuscate their writing style. Okay, that was walking, writing, and then of course is our cell phones. The very act of keeping a cell phone turned on creates a record of where your cell phone is over time in relationship to cellular towers, and therefore on a map. And this information can be incredibly revealing. It can reveal sensitive details to include not just who you are, but also how you live your life and what activities you're undertaking. This came from a New York Times study illustrating that exact point. And it was able to actually show when a detective was investigating a specific crime scene late one night. So, and this is not, of course, meant to be an exhaustive list. If everything we do generates data, and data at large enough volumes generates insights we can't predict, the types of intimate insights that arise from our data are only going to grow. And here's the key, these insights will continue to surprise us. That is, after all, the entire value of these new technologies. Human minds cannot predict or sometimes even understand them. And so, what does this mean for privacy, or to more closely mirror the language used by the legal system in the United States, what does that mean for our reasonable expectations related to our privacy? And I would argue that it means that our expectations of privacy must diminish as we generate more data, which we are committed to doing over time. We generate, for example, an estimated 2.5 quintillion bytes of data every day. To folks who are unfamiliar with this metric, as I was when I first came across this statistic, 1 quintillion is 1,000 raised to the power of 6, or 10 to the 18th power. And so my first point is that privacy as we've known it, privacy as it's been defined in the courts and conceived of in law school classrooms and thought about in the minds of consumers all over the world, is no longer. We can and we should expect less and less privacy as we generate more and more data. That is simply our new reality. Instead, something else needs to rise to take this traditional notion of privacy's place, or, and this is what I fear, and this is frankly what I see, or we will be left with an irrelevant legal concept that fails to apply to an increasingly urgent set of rights. So I have some suggestions for what exactly that framework should look like, and I'm going to return to those suggestions at the end of this talk. Okay, back to the agenda. We talked about privacy, now on to trust. So one of my favorite books of the last few years, perhaps I think the most overlooked, was published by a Norwegian academic named Olav Lisny in 2018. And it was given this extremely non-user-friendly name, which I will see if I can say in one breath. The Huawei and Snowden questions: can electronic equipment from untrusted vendors be verified? I can't do it, it's so long. Can an untrusted vendor build trust into electronic equipment? So this book was not aimed at a technical audience, as you can tell from the title. So it's really no wonder that it didn't make a huge splash in the legal community or the general public. But its conclusions, I think, are deeply impactful to every one of us today. And so here's Olav's story. A few years ago, the Norwegian government realized that it bought almost all of its critical technology from outside of Norway. With a population of just over 5 million people, it would be expensive to try to make all of their critical technology internally. You can think of the software that runs things like electric stations, water pumps, and cellular towers. And so the government there came up with a pressing national security question, which was this: how could it trust the technology that it was increasingly reliant upon? What could Norway actually do to verify that the software it was using was trustworthy? And that's where Olav came in. Olav looked into the question, first for the government on a commission, and it later culminated in this book that he published. I also think there is a PDF of that book online for free, published by Springer, if folks are interested. So Olav's answer: The government simply could not verify software as trustworthy, and in fact, no one can. The very nature of our current software systems, the very complexity underlying them, their supply chains and more, makes it impossible to detect intentionally inserted vulnerabilities into software by software makers. So to be clear, in traditional information security, we think of the adversary and the vendor as being unrelated, as being two different parties. But instead, the question Olaf focused on was, how do we know that the people we're buying software from haven't sabotaged it somehow? How, for example, can we prove they're not trying to surveil us through the software, or that there isn't something like an intentionally implanted kill switch that would render the software unfunctional? And so public examples of this type of attack are few and far between. The same year the book was published, the cover of Bloomberg Businessweek in the US featured a highly controversial story, that alleged factories in China implanted a tiny microchip, not much bigger than a grain of rice, into circuit boards designed for data centers. You can see a picture of that here. And this was alleged to have impacted almost 30 US companies, including Amazon and Apple. According to the article, the chips allowed the attackers to create a stealth doorway into any network that included the altered machines. So this would be one example of the type of worry Olaf was addressing. Another comes from Volkswagen's so-called Dieselgate scandal, in